Hi, everyone. Good morning and afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. Just give everyone a second to roll in here. All right, hello. I'm Carolyn Evemy. I'm a research associate here at the National Safety Council, and I'm really glad that you're here for this session on generative AI in EHS. So we're going to spend the next hour looking at how these tools are starting to show up in workplace safety conversations. But we're not here to speculate or sell anything. This is a session that's grounded in a literature review, to which you can see the title on the screen, which really means that we took a systematic look at published research and credible reports from 2019 to 2024 to really understand what's actually being said and studied about generative AI in EHS context. A literature review is a really great way to step back and ask, what do we already know? What patterns are emerging? And where are there gaps? So it's not about predicting the future. It's really about identifying where the conversation is already happening and what that tells us about opportunities, risks, and the areas where we need more attention. So today I'll walk you through what we found, what it might mean for your work, and some of the ethical questions that are starting to surface. And I'll also mention that, please feel free to add your questions to the chat as we move forward here. We will do our best to get to them at the end of the presentation. If there isn't time, feel free to email me directly, and I will provide my email at the end. All right, so I wanted to give just a little bit of an overview into what we'll cover for the next hour. So we'll start with really just a quick overview of what generative AI is and why it's becoming a part of workplace safety conversations. This will really include things like how it differs from traditional AI and why that distinction really matters in the context of safety. Then we'll look at why generative AI specifically matters for workplace safety. So looking at emerging applications that we identified in our review, and then to see why this conversation and investigation are really critical moves for the safety world in the modern age. Then we'll take a look at what I call unresolved risks, but we'll address what really are critical gaps and challenges. So things like validation, explainability, data quality and privacy, organizational readiness, etc. The areas really where we saw caution and structural oversight were really essential here. And then lastly, we'll look at some critical questions for the next phase. This is really a huge part of every literature review, looking at forward-looking questions. So what research, additional research is needed? How do we build these different frameworks? What approaches should we take to ensure that a generative AI is ethical, sustainable, and can be adopted across diverse workplaces? So by the end of this session, you'll have a clear picture of where generative AI stands in EHS today, really its potential and limitations, and then the questions that we need to answer moving forward. So let's get started with just a bit of a background into the National Safety Council. I really like this slide because it really defines one of the things that truly sets the National Safety Council apart. It's really its commitment to data-driven decision making. So from the very beginning, NSC has believed in the power of research to drive real change. And this commitment dates all the way back to 1921, when the council published its first comprehensive analysis of public accidents. And since then, it's been the foundation for everything we do. So from program development to policy recommendations and safety campaigns and even educational tools. Over the decades, NSC has continued to evolve, publishing resources like Injury Facts, which is the publicly accessible data repository of workplace preventable injuries and deaths, and countless special reports, which you can see some of just featured here. And, from early black and white reports to those more modern and interactive formats we've used today, these publications have become a trusted reference in the safety world, relied on by industries, lawmakers, and educators alike. But the goal has always remained the same: to collect accurate, actionable data and to use it to reduce risk, prevent harm, and then ultimately save lives. And I think this is really important that NSC doesn't just follow the data, they really lead with it. So every safety recommendation that we make, every training module, every strategic initiative that we do is really rooted in careful analysis and rigorous research. And this is incredibly important because when the goal is, things like zero preventable deaths, you really can't afford to guess. So today I'm speaking to you as, oh, my apologies. Today I'm speaking to you as an employee of the National Safety Council, but also as the research associate and main researcher for the Campbell Institute, which is just one of many membership opportunities that the NSC provides. The Campbell Institute exists with this really powerful vision to be the trusted source for promoting EHS excellence. We're a respected global thought leader for knowledge on keeping people safe. And when it comes to looking after the health and safety of all individuals on and off the job and their communities, organizations seek out the Campbell Institute for expert knowledge and progressive research. The Institute really empowers organizations of all sizes and sectors to become world class in EHS. Then this is done through engagement and knowledge sharing. So, no matter where you are on your safety journey, we hope to inspire all organizations to attain and maintain the highest EHS standard through the gathering and sharing of member best practices and lessons learned. These are the organizations that make the Campbell Institute what it is. And membership really here is not just a name on a list, it's a commitment to advancing EHS excellence and shaping the future of workplace safety. Our members are the ones really who bring all of this to life. They drive programs, share insights, and collaborate to solve some of the toughest challenges in safety and health right now. And what makes Campbell membership unique is really the depth of its engagement. It's not just about policies, it's really about people. We work together, we listen, we learn, and we challenge old ways of thinking. We share hard truths, we embrace feedback, and we push for approaches that make safety real, human, and evolving. So, from research to strategy implementation and advocacy, our members lead the way. They're building cultures where safety isn't just a box to check, it's a value that's lived every day. And that's really the power of being a part of the Campbell Institute. And so, to get into kind of some of the meat of today's presentation, I really want to start with the basics. So, what is generative AI and why does it matter to workplace safety? So you might know, generally what generative AI is. It can refer to new tools and create new content, things like text, images, code, audio, or video. And it's based on patterns learned from large data sets. And these tools don't just retrieve information, they generate something new. That's really the distinction there. But here's the first challenge that we faced in the review. There really isn't one universally accepted definition of generative AI. So across the literature, we found tons of different interpretations, some based more on the technical architecture, others in specific use cases, and some that are really doing some blurring between AI as a general concept and generative AI. So really, rather than adopt some type of single definition, we decided to craft our own, which was grounded in how the term was being used across these different credible sources. And that allowed us really to consistently evaluate the studies that we reviewed without relying on the assumptions of outside language. And this approach also helped us stay focused on the tools that are actually generating content. So though not just those that are analyzing or classifying data. And I wanted to show this slide on the left. I know it's a little bit text heavy, but this shows the definition that we used in our review and the teams who shaped it. So on the left, you can see one of our primary resources for this definition, which was adapted from the network of the National Library of Medicine. We started with that as a foundation because it's very widely recognized and research-based. From there, the NSC research team and the Campbell Institute Research Subcommittee worked together to refine it. So the subcommittee was a group of member organizations who volunteered their time to participate in and direct Campbell Institute research. They brought practical insight from the field, which really helped us make sure this definition wasn't just academic. It was really relevant to EHS context. And here's the definition. Here's what the definition says. So generative AI is a system of algorithms or computer processes that can create novel output. That's really an important part here. So producing new content such as text, speech, image, or video, or structured outputs by learning from existing data and generating novel outputs. So this is the definition that we use that gave a really clear boundary for our review. It helped us filter out conventional AI applications and all those things that I just mentioned. So moving forward, everything that I present is really grounded in this definition. It's not really just a technical label, it's the lens that we took to scope this review. And this was a structured review. So it was really designed to answer one practical question. So, what do we actually know about generative AI in EHS? So we took a look at published materials from 2019 to 2024. This included things like peer-reviewed studies, industry reports, and credible gray literature as well from corporate entities. And we weren't just getting headlines here. We were looking for sources that directly addressed how generative AI was being used, tested, and discussed in EHS context. So, out of the hundreds of initial records, we selected 27 publications that met our criteria. These covered a wide range of industries. And then also, this process really gave us a solid foundation to understand what's happening now, what's being tried, and where the research is really still catching up, so to speak. It's not necessarily exhaustive, but it's representative, and it's a starting point for a deeper conversation. And generally, you can see on the left, here's what we found. Um, so there was really a surge in generative AI publications from 2023 to 2024, which was the first thing that we really identified when taking a really broad look at this. That surge is really significant because it signals this shift from curiosity to active exploration. And, also the branching out from generative AI to from tech conversations and tech circles to actually bridging over to safety and health and looking at its potential impact there. This somewhat aligns with what we've seen in the broader market with things like ChatGPT and other large language models that have become readily available to the general public. But still, very notable that the vast majority of what we found had been published in the last, 2 to 3 years. The second was really that 17, and to emphasize that 17 of the 27 studies that we identified were from 2024 alone, which, tells us that it's very new. But it also tells us that the evidence here is still exploratory. It's conceptual frameworks, pilot projects, and early case studies. There's very few identified longitudinal data or implementation outcomes. So while the interest is accelerating, we're still really in the early stages and we're still learning what works and what doesn't work. And then the last thing I wanted to mention here was that, this wasn't just a North American or US conversation. We saw studies from Europe and Asia and across different industries like construction and healthcare, manufacturing and logistics. That diversity, I think, really matters here because it shows that generative AI is being tested in environments with really different risk profiles. So everything from high hazard sectors like construction to highly regulated spaces like healthcare, which can bring a lot of different and unique challenges. So really to say, generative AI is emerging fast. That's what we can see here. But the research is still catching up. The context is critical as we move into what these studies actually say. There were a few instances where generative AI was emerging in EHS that really highlight why we decided to take this focus. So I have four of them listed here. First, you can see, just in terms of making sense of reports, safety teams deal with mountains of information. So incident reports, inspection notes, maintenance logs, the works. And these documents are often unstructured, scattered across systems, and also written in different styles by different folks. Generative AI can help here by reviewing all that data and pulling out patterns that humans might miss. We saw an example from this that was a virtual risk assistant that was tested in real workplaces. So it took a look at ergonomic risks in real time and flagged hazards that oftentimes, when compared to a human counterpart, were extensively covered compared to the human version. And not to say that that's necessarily just to say that there was overlooked risks and hazards on the human side compared to that actual assessment from the virtual risk assessment. Another one looked at summarizing hundreds of safety reports into clear trends. which really seemed to help leaders spot recurring issues faster, was kind of the main benefit pointed out. This matters to in many organizations. Valuable insights are often buried in text-heavy reports that no one has time to read. AI can substitute or can surface those insights quickly, making it easier to act before those small problems become serious incidents. But you'll hear this a lot. Here's, the caution. These tools are still really experimental. They require human oversight. The literature really warns here about over-reliance of AI because of things like, explainability and how it can sound very confident. I'll get into some of that in just a little bit. The next year is really for around planning for risks. So, some studies looked at generative AI's potential to create synthetic data and simulate rare hazard scenarios. And this is a potential avenue because traditional risk models often struggle with things like low frequency and high impact events, things that don't have, aka things that don't have to happen often, but can actually cause serious harm. And one paper even highlighted how AI generated scenarios help their safety teams prepare for what they called unusual events, like equipment failures that rarely occur but have severe consequences. And this is really powerful because it allows organizations almost to stress test their safety systems against scenarios that they might have never considered. But again, there's a huge caveat here. Synthetic data has to be checked very carefully. And if it doesn't reflect real world conditions, it can lead you in the wrong direction. So it's promising, but it's not necessarily a plug and play. The third one here is this training. I think this is a really exciting area for generative AI. It's these papers that were published around training were really looking to utilize these tools to build multilingual, job-specific training materials in minutes and then update them whenever procedures change. So one study actually looked at construction workers who spoke multiple languages. AI was able to actually create tailored training content and immersive simulations that help workers understand site-specific hazards in multiple languages. And this improved engagement and comprehension compared to those traditional training materials that they had access to. I think another a really interesting component of this is that it's an adaptive trading environment potentially. So if there's changes, in the dynamics based on real-time conditions or worker feedback, that's actually updated within the system. And that's a very potentially a very large leap from, a traditional static manual that has to be manually updated over time. And again, here, it's important to acknowledge the human aspect of that, making sure that trust really matters here, and making sure that the content is accurate and culturally relevant is incredibly important. And I'll get into a little bit of detail later about some of the ways that we want to continue to explore that. And then finally, here you have supporting work in the field. So imagine you're a technician doing some type of complex repair. Instead of flipping through a manual, you could ask an AI assistant here for step-by-step guidance. The potential there is really huge for on-the-job type training, especially in environments where procedures are changing often and workers need, quick answers. But again, these tools should support experts, not necessarily replace them. And so, really, to sum up this slide, I wanted to say that generative AI can help us process information faster, helps us plan for risks, train better, and support workers in the field. But every study that we reviewed says the same things. These tools are still experimental. They need validation, they need transparency, they need strong governance before they can become a part of everyday safety practice and be reliable and valid tools. So, in some ways, you can think of them as decision support tools, not decision makers. And, that is a potential safe way forward. We talked a lot about opportunities just now, and I think, while the literature makes it clear that that's where there's emerging opportunity within occupational health and safety, there is also a huge and exhaustive list of challenges that come along with this as well. Like I mentioned, most of these applications are still very experimental. There were really very few validated real-world high-risk environment models that were published in any type of literature that we reviewed. So we really found six big areas of unresolved risk that I'll call in applying generative AI to EHS contexts. So we're looking at evidence and validation, explainability and accuracy, data quality and privacy, organizational readiness, misaligned success metrics, and then governance and ethics. And what this section that will follow this isn't, I want to state very clearly, isn't a critique of innovation, but it's really to take a safety-minded inventory of what's missing so that leaders can pilot responsibly and integrate these tools responsibly as well. So thinking about it really from a safety-minded perspective and not as so to speak, a pessimist. So the first one here is this evidence and validation gaps. And this one is first because it's really one of the biggest gaps that we found. So across the literature, most of the implementations of generative AI and EHS were still conceptual at the pilot stage. Very few were validated in high-risk real-world environments, and then even fewer are actually documented in real-time workplace environments. And why does this matter? Because pilots often happen under ideal circumstances or conditions. So curated data sets, direct vendor support, and limited scope. Once these tools hit the variability of day-to-day operations, you're looking at, unpredictable environments. You're looking at shift changes, you're looking at turnover, you're looking at contractor employment, language diversity, legacy systems, the likes. And really, what looks promising in a controlled setting or in a piloted setting can behave very differently actually in the field. So the literature really looks at and calls for more need for validated and evidence-based, backing for generative AI and EHS, whether that comes through longitudinal studies, some type of study that tracks the outcomes of generative AI over time, is what I mean by longitudinal. Also looking at post-deployment evaluations and comparing that to AI-assisted processes and traditional controls. It's really the main takeaway here is that without the arc of evidence, we really just don't know how these tools will hold up under pressure. And in safety critical environments, that is a huge and important component to this. The next that I wanted to talk about is this explainability and accuracy. So explainability is actually this term that's commonly used in the AI world, that really means that in layman's terms that the model is actually describing to you how it came to that conclusion. So if you're thinking about, maybe doing a test in school and your professor or teacher made you show your work on your math assignment, that's kind of the same concept that we're discussing here. Just the proof in behind the output. Um, this is really important because this is where trust lives and dies. Generative AI tools can sound incredibly confident. They produce answers that look polished and authoritative. But here's the problem. Confidence does not always equal correctness, and these systems can mask uncertainty, and especially in safety critical environments, that's really a cause for concern. So in EHS, it's really not enough of an answer to sound plausible. We need to know why an alert was generated and what evidence supports it. If a tool says add a guardrail, we need to understand the reasoning behind that recommendation, for example. Was it based in a specific hazard report, a pattern of past incidents? Without that type of transparency, we're really flying blind to these recommendations. So several sources stress the same point in regards to this. As of right now, keeping the human in control, especially when the outputs influence hazard controls or emergency actions. And here's the practical gap. If a generative AI tool recommends a corrective action, who verifies it? Can we reconstruct the rationale during an incident investigation? If there's no audit trail, explainability is missing. And so is organizational trust. They really, just like, you would have to trust an individual's recommendation based on just the output, the very same is true with generative AI. And this can cause, I will say, an issue with over reliance. People tend to trust that confident and fluent language. So if something sounds polished, we're more likely to tend to assume that it's right. And that's potentially really a real challenge or risk because silent failure modes, errors that aren't obvious, those are the types of things that can slip through if we are not mindful of the framing that the model is presenting the information to us in. So really here, generative AI can assist, but it can't replace expert judgment. Explainability also isn't something that's optional. It's really foundational for implementing any type of generative AI tool into an EHS, into some type of EHS management system. Now I want to talk a little bit about data, which is really the foundation of any generative AI system. A lot of folks that I've heard say, your model is only as good as the data that it relies on. And if you think about data privacy, quality, and the use of synthetic data from generative AI perspective, you can think of it like building a house. If the foundation is cracked, the whole structure is unstable. And for generative AI, the foundation is that data. If the data is incomplete or messy, for instance, the outputs can't be trusted. And many safety and health data sets are scattered across different systems, use inconsistent labels, and often miss key details. There's even a lot of variability between industries, between organizations themselves, and how they define and utilize these different terms and metrics. So imagine trying to piece together a puzzle when half the pieces are missing and the rest don't fit. And that's really the challenge that a generative AI system would face if data quality is poor. Privacy here adds just another layer of complexity. Some pools pull from worker messages, health related signals, and even video feeds. And without strong safeguards, this can expose very sensitive information, things like personal health indicators or private conversations. The literature warns that without clear rules, these tools could create compliance risk and erode trust among employees, which I think is a very important add on there. Then there's the use of the synthetic data, which I had mentioned a little bit earlier. AI generated data can be used to fill gaps and simulate rare scenarios, which sounds really great on paper and can be potentially a really powerful tool. But does the synthetic data actually reflect real risk conditions, or is it possible that it could accidentally introduce new bias, like overrepresenting one site or one workforce group? If that can happen, then AI might make recommendations that don't fit your real world environment. So again, great on paper, but a lot of challenge underneath in just that data quality and the reliance even of the generated output of the data. Um, and then further with that synthetic data, who owns that data once it's created? How long do you keep that data once it's created? Who gets access to the raw versus summarized information? These aren't just technical questions, they're really the foundations of building accountability and trust within these systems. And without clear governance in these areas, this could be a real challenge for organizations trying to adopt these different tools and utilize these different strategies. So really, we're looking, for a need for clean representative data here. We're looking for strong privacy protections, and we're looking for clear rules for synthetic data, including ownership, retention, and access. And without these, the promise of generative AI can turn into new risks. It's not about stopping innovation here. It's about building the right foundation so innovation is safe and sustainable over time. Next, we've got organizational readiness, which I think a lot of folks will probably resonate with this. Most of these tools will fail without the right people, processes, and skills in place to manage them. The literature highlights this in several different ways. So, the first and one of the largest is AI literacy gaps. Many managers and frontline teams simply don't have the background to understand what these tools can do and can't do. And that creates risk because misunderstanding can lead to misuse. For example, if a supervisor assumes that an AI generated report is always correct, they might skip a critical review step. And the second here is really skepticism. People are wary of machine-generated narratives. If a tool writes a safety report, will your team trust it, or will they ignore it because they feel it's disconnected from their reality? Trust is really earned here, and without transparency and training, skepticism can stall adoption. And the third is really role ambiguity. I think some of us have probably seen these new positions being created at organizations, but there's a really big gap here in who owns not just the generative AI production, but also the risk. Is it EHS? Is it legal or HR? Without clear accountability, decisions can stall, or worse, they can occur without any kind of proper oversight. And this really isn't just a governance issue, this is a safety issue. For small and medium-sized businesses, these hurdles can get even bigger because they have additional factors like cost and infrastructure and data management, and uncertainty about compliance with evolving expectations around AI transparency and oversight. Many small to medium-sized businesses operate with lean teams and limited budgets, so that makes it really hard to invest in both the technology and the training needed to use it responsibly. And many of these systems are really not designed with the input from the people who will actually use them. They're built from a technology first perspective, not a frontline perspective. That means that workflows don't often fit real world conditions like shift changes, language diversity, or pace of field operations. Images, imagine a tool that assumes everyone has constant internet access or speaks the same language. That's really a potential recipe for failure. When a tool doesn't reflect the realities of the work actually being done, it can be a really big gap or challenge to have a successful adoption or implementation. Next, I want to talk a little bit about metrics. I found this particularly interesting in our findings here. There was a lot of variability in how we measure success. And, right now, most of the studies that we reviewed, they use highly technical metrics, processing speed, classification accuracy, or relevancy of the generated content. Those are great for engineers and IT folks, but they're not really the point of safety practice. Safety isn't about how fast the algorithm runs, it's about whether hazards are controlled and people go home safe. So, here's really a gap here is that very few papers tracked actual practical safety outcomes. Things like our near miss reports more detailed and actionable. Are hazard closure times improving? Are corrective actions more effective than they were? Um, you know, and some additional questions that we could ask of generative AI here are really does generative AI improve risk identification quality? Does it reduce the time to control hazards? Does it raise reporting participation? Especially in different areas, like in on sites where there's multilingual workforces or language barriers that often cause slow reporting or other barriers. Um, Without these types of measures, we risk tools that really look strong in a lab setting, but then don't move the safety needle in real life. And a system might generate perfect summaries, but if hazards aren't being closed faster or workers aren't reporting more issues, then the technology isn't delivering that real value. So, really often what we learned is that often, safety is not, or these systems aren't defined in terms of safety outcomes. They're defined in terms of algorithmic performance. And what we know is that metrics should reflect what matters most: reducing risk, improving engagement, and strengthening safety culture. So if we don't measure those things, we don't know whether AI is helping or just adding complexity. And then the last one here that I wanted to cover was this ethics and governance piece. It's really the backbone of safe adoption. The literature consistently calls for validation frameworks, fail-safe designs, bias assessments, and accountability. But the reality is that very few sources present complete field-tested protocols tailored to generative AI in health and safety contexts. And really, two gaps within this stood out to me. The first is audibility. Organizations need the ability to reconstruct inputs, outputs, and human decisions for investigations. If AI generated recommendation leads to an action, can we trace that back to the data that informed it? Can we show who approved it? Without that audit trail, that accountability breaks down. And in safety critical environments, that can lead to misleading implementations, that can lead to misunderstanding root cause investigations, and undermining a lot of the preventative and safety two type work that we're really pushing in the modern times. The second is this concept of really setting up boundaries. So we need formal definitions of where generative AI may assist versus where it cannot. Things like drafting reports, for example, or summarizing data or generating options might be an appropriate use of generative AI. But making final risk rankings, making a medical judgment, interpreting a regulatory application, those are areas where you might see more variability, where you might see more human-led intervention. And right now, we don't have clear boundaries between those two. And without those, we really risk the potential of erosion of trust, of overreach and over-reliance on these systems. And bridging these gaps, means adapting existing safety management systems to treat generative AI as a controlled process and not a plug and play tool. So that includes change management, verification steps, and management of change processes baked in from the start. And really the takeaway again here is simple. Just like with all of these challenges, governance and ethics is not about slowing innovation. It's about making sure that innovation doesn't compromise safety. If we build these guardrails now, for instance, we can unlock generative AI's potential without creating new risks. And, you know, another part of this review um, is really in all literature reviews is really identifying areas for future research. It's one of the most critical components of a literature review. And here we identified a a bunch of different research questions that are still left unanswered for the scientific and safety communities at large. Um, so why is future research really so important? It's really because most of what we know today comes from pilots or conceptual studies in this regard. And those are useful, but they don't really tell us how these tools behave over time, across cultures, or under real world conditions. So in this case, without, that type of evidence, we really risk scaling this technology that looks promising in theory, but actually fails in practice. And that's why, these areas that you see here are so critical. They represent, areas in the literature that we identified that we need to answer before generative AI can really become a trusted process within the EHS management system. So, in other words, this review is not the finish line. It's really the starting point for the next phase of research and collaboration. I wanted to just take a moment here to break down each of these different um, potential research questions. So first, I know I've discussed a little bit, but there's a huge call for longitudinal studies. Most of the current evidence comes from really short pilots or conceptual papers, so we don't know how generative AI behaves over months or years, even in a real EHS environment. And we know that matters, as we discussed, because AI models can drift, their outputs can change as data patterns shift or workflows evolve. So without that long-term observation, we really risk deploying these tools that degrade silently. We need more studies that track things like performance stability, error rates, and user trust over time, and examine organizational factors like training and governance. This is really, I think, a critical component to move generative AI applications in EHS from proof of concept to more of a sustainable and reliable practice. Next, I wanted to talk about validation frameworks. There's really one clear outcome from the literature. Before generative AI becomes a part of safety critical workflows, we need more structured protocols to keep it reliable and accountable. Think about the standards that we already trust. ISO certifications, OSHA compliance, the works. These frameworks exist for equipment and processes, but we don't have the same standard operating procedures and regulatory environments supporting generative systems at this time. And that's a gap that we need to close. And why does this matter? Well, I'm sure you can imagine, but without these types of clear rules, we cannot guarantee that AI outputs are either accurate or safe. Imagine a tool that drafts a safety procedure, for example. If it makes an error, how do we catch that? If something goes wrong, how do we roll back to a safe state? So, future research needs to answer these questions by looking into the development of these practical frameworks. That means accounting for things like acceptance criteria. What does safe enough look like for AI outputs? Audit trails so we can trace back decisions during investigations and make sure that the explainability is accounted for, and rollback triggers to, clear steps and revert if something fails. The recommendation is really from the literature to build on what we already know here. Adapt existing safety management systems and management of change processes to include generative AI. That really means formal sign-offs, documented reviews, and periodic reevaluation because we know that AI can drift over time. And this includes even the most complex and highly supported systems with incredible data quality. We still see this drift over time. And this validation is also not about slowing innovation. It's really about making sure that we have the tools and procedures in place to verify the implementation of these before, we move forward with them. The next one I want to discuss was looking into multimodal systems. Multimodal really, in this case, it means integrating different types of data. So images from inspections, sensor readings from equipment, videos from cameras, or even audio from worker communications is all referred to here. And there's a lot of interest in trying to look at utilizing a combination of these different multimodal systems to generate I would call richer insights. But there's a lot of questions left unasked about this. Things about looking at integrating Internet of Things sensor data with generative models, could improve hazard prediction and situational awareness. So something that, for instance, combines temperature readings, vibration data, and visual cues to predict equipment failure before it happens. But this is really complicated in actuality. These multimodal systems raise new challenges in data governance. Who owns and secures all of these different data systems, for example? They also raise questions about explainability. How do we understand the logic behind an AI recommendation when it's based on 5 different inputs, for instance? And then finally, the computational cost. These systems require significant resources, and that can be a barrier for smaller to medium organizations or even larger organizations that don't have the dedicated allocation for these types of tools. And so to take this away, there's a lot of interesting opportunity here within the multimodal system integration that could transform safety insights. But there's a lot of careful and necessary research that needs to be done in that now that to ensure that this is practical, transparent, and secure in its use. Next, I wanted to talk about cross-cultural testing. So, while a few of our studies did explore generative AI application in bilingual contexts, most of the research that we evaluated still concentrated in specific regions or with specifically one language. And that's a problem for EHS because it's a global practice and we know that safety practices can vary widely across cultures, regulations, and work environments. So generative AI tools trained on one language or regulatory framework may produce outputs that don't necessarily align with another. And that can create risks for accuracy, for compliance, for worker trust. For example, a tool that was designed for OSHA standards might generate recommendations that don't fit European or Asian regulations, or use terminology that confuses workers in multilingual teams. So when we're looking at future research in this direction, we're really looking to validate generative AI in diverse settings, multilingual, multicultural, and multi-regulatory. We're looking at future research that is testing for bias in these outputs. We're looking at ensuring that there's terminology accuracy across languages. There's no type of human verification, or if there is, it's producing, sound and reliable output over time. And we're looking to adapt content to local norms and cultural experiences because we know how important that variability is for building engagement, for building trust from, the bottom to the top, really, of the workforce. And why does this all matter? The safety communication is really only effective when it's understood and trusted. So if generative AI training or incident reports don't reflect local languages or cultural contexts, adoption can fail, and mistrust can build amongst your employees. And this is also incredibly important because, as we know in EHS, this type of cross-cultural accountability is not necessarily optional. It's really essential for making generative AI tools, equitable, compliant, and practical for global safety programs. I also wanted to discuss, environmental impact. And I highlighted it S here, but I think you can highlight E as well. Generative AI does not run on ideas, it runs on energy. And these large models require significant computing power, and that can mean a real carbon footprint. So there's a real call in the literature to first assess energy consumption and carbon impact of generative AI systems. For instance, if we're adding these tools to safety programs, we should really understand the environmental impact of those additions. Second, when we're looking at exploring sustainable AI practices for EHS applications, can we design models that use less energy? Can we schedule heavy computing tasks during off-peak hours or use greener data centers? These are just practical insights or practical steps that need further investigation. And really, there's a trade-off here between safety benefits and environmental cost. If a tool reduces serious incidents but increases energy use, how do we weigh those impacts? So, future research should really help organizations make informed decisions that balance safety performance with sustainability goals. And I think that's incredibly important for the health and safety community at large because we're also looking at accountability of the environmental impact as a whole. Is there anyone at your organization that is going to be accountable for the environmental impact of the utilization of these tools, especially as they're scaled? And is that something that's going to be accounted for over time as we start to learn more and more about what this environmental impact actually looks like in real time? So really, the takeaway here is that we're not looking to compete with sustainability. We're looking to align. And, understanding the environmental footprint for generative AI is essential, really, for responsible adoption. So as we wrap up here, I wanted to just give a little bit of some final takeaways. I really appreciate all of your time so far. I just wanted to give us, just an overview of what this literature review told us and what it really means. So overall, generative AI in EHS is promising. It's cool, it's new, it's incredible the opportunities that were being provided that we would have never imagined would be available to us before. But it's still very much in early stages, and especially for health and safety, that can mean really high risk. Most of what we see today are not fully validated systems. They're conceptual models, they're pilot tested models, they're built by, IT folks and folks that are more tech heavy than, impacted by the frontline workforce or by even health and safety professionals at large. And that really means that organizations should approach this adaptation cautiously and really with strong oversight and governance. There's a lot of push from regulatory agencies to keep what they call a human in control, which actually the paper goes into a bit in more detail, but just really to make sure that you're prioritizing how a human is involved in that process, where they stand, and to make sure that all of the output is being verified and accounted for in the various ways that I described today. The second is really that generative AI augments human experience or expertise. It certainly does not replace it. Safety decisions require judgment, context, and accountability. These tools can help by summarizing reports and drafting training content or generating options, but the final call should stay with qualified professionals. And I think to some extent we can see that from a logical perspective as well, too, right? The AI, the model is built off of the data that you're providing. And so who's creating, the data collection opportunities, who's identifying what type of data needs to be collected? The person who, eventually, and it should take executive decision-making control over the strategic approach as well, or on the approval of the decision or the output of the model. And then really, when we're looking at the tool itself, there's really four things that stood out from this review that are incredibly important to consider and to account for when you're trying to decide, is this the right decision for my organization? Is this actually going to be beneficial? Or is this, not the right fit for us? And so first you see there, transparency. We really need to know how the outputs are generated and what data they rely on. That's the explainability aspect of it. That's being able to make sure that we are not just taking output and acting on it without understanding the root cause. We know that very well in the health and safety world, but at the same time, when we have things like AI literacy issues, you can't assume that everybody knows that information at your organization. So it's something that needs to be accounted for. Next is really the interpretability. When it comes again to AI literacy, it's important to understand that your model is going to present itself and frame in this confident from this confident perspective. And these types of recommendations that are outputted, they need to be understandable from folks that don't have a technical background. They should not be a black box of information for folks to, inevitably put more work on their plate. They've got to be understandable, and in that sense, they've got to be reliable. You should know, your frontline workforce should know what to expect generally when they're utilizing these tools. The next is really the ethical soundness. So, really thinking about your data, protecting your data, thinking about privacy, thinking about inputs of bias, especially within that output, and then thinking about fairness, fairness of data usage, fairness of data collection, and who is accountable and responsible for making sure that data privacy and security are actually a main priority in these different implementations. And then last, these tools really should be built with input from the people who will use them so that they fit real workflows and they earn trust. It's very, it's always very interesting to see someone pick up a new tool for the first time and see how they will use it. I think it's in the health and safety context, it's incredibly critical to get that type of feedback from the get-go, from the frontline workforce, so that you're making sure that you're creating tools that are actionable and really useful for your employees. And no better way to get that information than to go straight to the source and collect that feedback from the folks that will use it the most. And really here, to say one bottom line, it's to say that generative AI, it can support safety, but only if we treat it as a controlled process and not as a shortcut or replacement. If we build these types of guardrails now, that's the opportunity that we have to unlock that innovation, and we won't compromise what matters most, which is really keeping people safe. So with that, I wanted to just spend the last few minutes here just sharing some of the NSC resources that I think are incredibly helpful as you start to dive deeper into this topic. So there's just a few here. You might see some links roll in the chat. The first one that I wanted to highlight was just really our Work to Zero program. I'm sure most are familiar with this program, but this is really our technology focus at NSC. This program is an incredible resource for folks that are interested in safety technology and learning more about how to push the needle. So if you go to their website, you can see just a variety of different resources, including some white papers on AI, where generative AI isn't necessarily the sole focus, but it gives really good recommendations on how to approach AI usage, more generally and broadly, and some of the types of considerations that your leaders and your senior managers might want to be accounting for as they start to work out these implementations. So just wanted to highlight that. I also wanted to highlight just some of the work that we're doing here at the Campbell Institute. You know, in case you're not familiar with us, I just wanted to share some information. You know, we're at the Campbell Institute, research is one of our main priorities. And while it's directed by our members, we still go in it with some underlying goals. So I just shared those here. We work to develop original research offerings in advanced collective knowledge. We work to evaluate NSC programs and to prove efficacy. We gather current resources in key topic areas and consolidate findings, like what you've heard today. We partner with others to collect current, common, or proven practices, and we pilot NSC resources and findings to validate processes. So it's really the heart of what we do. We do a whole range of different, research methodologies. We engage with a whole wide range of folks, and I just wanted to share out, generally what that looks like. So, to give just an example of some of the work that we put out, in addition to our exploring the role of generative AI in EHS, we also have two other publications that came out this year. So we did another literature review earlier this year looking at the evolving relationship between EHS and voluntary turnover. I also did a webinar on that one as well. Um, that one was particularly interesting. We took a look at the impact of turnover on EHS overall, and then we took a look at what are some of the things that EHS professionals can do to actually, contribute to retention of employees. The second one that we did was called The Heart of Workplace Safety, Fostering Emotional Engagement for Lasting Impact. This was our deep dive into safety culture, and we looked at different techniques that some of our Campbell members had been utilizing to actually, create an emotional engagement with employees that really fosters this culture beyond compliance type thinking. And then like I said, the last one is just the paper that I'm discussing today, looking at generative AI and EHS. And I will say there's a lot of details shared in that paper that I did not have time to get into today. The paper was really intended to be timely, and also, share that information out of what we're seeing in the present state. So if you haven't gotten the chance to take a look at that, please feel free to do so. And then I also just wanted to highlight where we're looking at heading. So at the Campbell Institute, we have a lot of interesting projects underway. Just in fiscal year 2026, we're looking at publishing a new white paper focused on SIF contractor management. We are looking at testing the NSC SIF prevention model. If you have seen an email roll in, that is from me. We're looking to pilot with 5 companies, and really to inform future iterations of the model, promote a continuous learning environment with our own output. And then we're collaborating with Insight Exposure and Risk Sciences to take a look at a holistic and integrated approach to occupational health risk management and organizational structure. So really excited for that one. That will be a publication through our NSC channels, as well as looking for additional publication opportunities on that one. So a lot of exciting you know, a lot of exciting stuff in the works here at the Campbell Institute. And I know I'm starting to run short on time, and I'm uh, probably the worst presenter at scheduling time for Q&A, so I do apologize, but please feel free to reach out to me or anyone on my team for questions. I just wanted to, put this slide up and say thank you to my team. None of this would be possible without them. I don't work in a silo. It's, very collaborative effort that we all make to create these types of resources for folks and to share this information out. So just want to say a huge thank you, give that list of the team. Also want to say a huge thank you to the members, to all the Campbell members, but especially those on the research subcommittee. They were the primary resource of member involvement for this project. So just wanted to shout that out as well. And I think that is all I have for today. Kenzie, am I missing any updates from our end before we close out?
Nope, I think that's everything.
All right, great. Well, with that, I will say thank you so much for attending today. It was great to get to talk to you about this. I am looking forward to hearing from you all. Please feel free to reach out with any comments, questions, or concerns. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your week.